Oh, great. Okay. Alhamdulillah. Okay. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I hope everyone is fine and weathering this COVID crisis well. I apologize for our delay today. I myself had to take precautionary measures and get tested for COVID myself this morning, so that is why we are delayed. But alhamdulillah, I am happy to be here with all of you and to um, be able to share a few words with you about this upcoming Eid. Inshallah, we will all be celebrating and with good spirit. So I'd like to get started. I want to talk about today the idea that tribulations may help refine us, but they do not define us. And looking at unpacking the tribulations that we are experiencing this year as we approach and come upon Eid Al Adha. No doubt you will have a wonderful experience listening to different khatibs online as we approach the Eid and on Eid, but from a different perspective, one from a mental health perspective. I wanted to just look at a few um, things that have come up and arisen around the Eid al Adha experience. So, in a few short days, we as Muslims and Americans across America will observe the celebration of Eid al Adha. And this is the bigger Eid of the two Eid holidays in the calendar year and in the Muslim faith. It represents the celebration of the completion of the Hajj, the spiritual pilgrimage that all Muslims who meet the conditions to do so are supposed to make once in their lifetimes. It will be different as we will not be able to celebrate it in the traditional manner that we have become accustomed to. But however, we can also still find a blessing even in this particular time. And that's what I want to touch base and talk about today. Many people, just like they did during Ramadan, will oscillate at this upcoming Eid between the feelings of like counting their blessings, having gratitude, to honoring grief and feelings of loss of the ability to make the journey to Hajj or celebrate with the community in the physical presence of others, feeling the energy and adulation that we normally experience when we are able to keep company with others. Some may even feel anger. And in this case, the boundary is one of grief and objecting to and advocating for the preservation of the norms that we as Muslims practice. So one could consider this even righteous anger, perhaps. Just the looks, the hugs, and the acknowledgements that people have become accustomed to will be very different this Eid. They will be absent or online, and something else will inevitably fill the void. What fills this void will vary depending on where people are in their lives, the work that they have put into their spiritual self-care, and whether they are isolated or connected to others and to God. I would like to ask our community and the community at large to consider three possibilities for filling this void. One, doing something that we don't often do by investing in emotions, discovering and thinking about the purpose of tribulation and investing in balancing our futures through leadership of another kind. So when something interrupts our lives, like an untimely death or an unexpected injury, a pandemic, or the recipe of all three, there can be such a range of feelings that almost anything you would feel would be quite normal. Grief doesn't have to have a particular look. It can feel and look like many manifestations, and yet we still know what it is when we feel it. Grief is natural. It's the homeopathic way that we process feelings of loss, sadness, and things that disappear or roles that are taken away, including rituals that cannot be performed. For example, our Eid prayer. Our emotions are a blessing because they allow us to cope with whatever we've been given as a tribulation to deal with in this particular life. People are often afraid of emotion because they have not had the privilege to explore them. And yes, I say privilege because to be able to actually sit and think about your emotions and sometimes sit with them is an actual privilege. Not everyone gets to enjoy this privilege equally. And people are often afraid of emotion because they have not had the privilege to explore this, or to recognize it, or embrace, or even connect to their emotions. Emotions and emotional intelligence will become handy not only for this Eid, but the more and more we face tribulation. So it can be beneficial not only for this Eid, but as we move forward as well. And we should consider these a blessing in the recognition of the tools we will need as we move through more and more tribulations, and how we can move through these tribulations with grace, as opposed to an alternative modality. When we're able to call upon our emotional banks, that which we've stored up in terms of tools, emotional tools, then we can be allowed to move more with grace and through difficulty with grace. While those emotional wells can include sadness, they can also include gratitude. Moving through the temporary states of emotions like sadness or hurt or anger to a place of and space of gratitude, happiness, or even joy and tranquility. This often marginalized and socially stigmatized tool set can help us move through this temporary tribulation we face, which has altered our expression of the celebration of Eid Al Adha. So we have it within ourselves to be able to weather this tribulation, even if we are all alone and isolated. We can call upon our own blessings that we've been given by having emotions and understanding them and moving through them. Emotions, as we know, are temporary states. While we recognize the emotional tool set that has escaped our landscape for some time, buried along with other traditions like the expressions of emotion through poetry and the applicability of music to therapies, or even arts as therapy, we ought to recognize that we don't want to go too far into the indulgence of just emotions either, right? So while we want to recognize emotions as a tool that can be helpful to us, we don't also want to get lost in what we would call a rabbit hole of emotions and just get stuck in our emotions. We want to utilize those emotions to help us move through the tribulations we face, but we don't want to get stuck there. Tribulations can act to refine us, right? But they don't have to define us. We encounter tribulations all the time, and when we accept them as part of life, because this life is in and of itself a test and tribulation, we can sometimes those tests come in the form of not having traditions carried out in the same manner. So for example, back in the month of Ramadan, we weren't able to perform Tarawih prayers like many Muslims normally do. And there were many who felt grief and a sense of loss because they weren't able to do that. Similarly, this Eid, because people have not been able to go to Hajj, because we won't be able to share Eid prayer in person, that loss may also come in the form of a tribulation, in the sense that people who have maybe been doing this for 40 years of their lives now suddenly are confronted with a change in their habits and in the way they do things, and they're not really sure how to cope with that. So perhaps this is to awaken us to the true meaning that goes beyond the rituals themselves, and reminding us that this whole life is but a temporary manifestation, much like emotional states. Emotional states are temporary, and so are the tribulations that we're facing within our community at this time. Both are temporary, and both can be and will be removed, and they will end. The poor are often a tribulation for the wealthy, and the wealthy are often a tribulation for the poor. The Muslim is a tribulation for the non-Muslim, and the non-Muslim a tribulation for the Muslim. We have tribulations every day, but what we don't often do is call them to recognition. Perhaps this Eid we can take time to recognize tribulation for what it is and utilize our emotions to get to a place of gratitude. After all, our beloved Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, encouraged us to look at those who have less than we do so that we might be grateful. This example, of course, is a tribulation in view of the dominant narrative that greed is good and too much is never enough. We have been presented with an opportunity as Muslims in America to elevate this tribulation and ask ourselves as individuals and as a community how we may move through it. One of the manifestations of this very tribulation of popular notions of moral values versus our moral values as Muslims. And this has moved me to humbly suggest we also consider another way to fill the void of absence of communal prayer and celebrations this Eid. Namely, I want to highlight the opportunity for communal and personal generosity this Eid toward women and the less fortunate. One of the quickest ways to pull ourselves out of burdensome, sad, or negative emotional states is to do for others. The acts of doing something for someone else or a group of people can pull you right out and through an elevated state with the added bonus of blessings earned. So in other words, while we can't congregate together, we have an opportunity here to effect action even from where we are in our own dwellings or limited reach that we have to help both women and the less fortunate. And I'll get to how here in just a second. But again, this along with being able to allow ourselves to feel our emotions and get into that emotional space and sit with that, move through it, and allow ourselves to reconcile and balance the imbalance that we're feeling during this Eid, we can move through that tribulation and take it as an opportunity to do something even more positive. So I got this idea from listening to a speech recently. I was listening to a speech by a beloved imam in America where he spoke of unburdening husbands as they were not responsible for footing the bill for their whole families going to Hajj. And so the idea was that he was encouraging them to go to Hajj and to not make a barrier that they would need to pay for their whole family or even their spouses because they may not be able to afford all those people going, but that maybe they could afford just themselves. And if they could just afford themselves, then they were obligated to go. And so he was trying to lighten the burden of feeling that one could not afford to go to Hajj. And in doing so, it particularly raised, a question for me as a woman in America, because while his point was to highlight the relief for brothers and encouraging them to fulfill their own obligations, we still live in a day and age in America where women do not get paid equally for equal work. So while I appreciate his speech, because I do think it's important, I also want to look at a nuanced piece of this, which is that all things being equal, we could say that women had an equal opportunity to go to Hajj from America, but all things aren't equal. Women are not paid equally for equal work. And this puts our women at a disadvantage. So, and it also doesn't take into account, other lifestyles. So for example, not everybody has an equal opportunity to find a mate for marriage. We have plenty of people who haven't been married in our community. We have converts, we have all different groups of people who literally don't have exactly equal access to going to Hajj or equal ability. And while we know that is not incumbent upon a person to go to Hajj if they can't afford to, what I want to try to suggest is something positive here in the recognition of a larger communal need. And that is, since we are not able to go this year to Hajj, and thinking about those who are less fortunate and who don't necessarily have the equal access or equal means, that we consider doing something about this as a community. And so the idea that I wanted to promote and ask that you consider as we move through this particular tribulation is that I want you to consider, for example, the facts I just gave you about equality in pay, but also in the promotion of our communal values. So if we have a woman, for example, who devotes her life to raising her family and therefore doesn't make money, and so she doesn't qualify to make Hajj, she may never also be able to go to Hajj. Now, there is no blame on her, but I think that we should also consider a larger communal value here, which is that we also assume that often women are the first educators of our children. If we have a whole large body of women that never make Hajj, how could they possibly educate their children about Hajj? How will they accurately be able to depict Hajj? And how can we expect them to inspire for even their young boys to aspire to go to Hajj? And so I want us to really sit with that and think about it because I think that there is something that we can do. And, if these were the only considerations, we could probably even rationalize them away. But I think that when we think about planned community and we think about trying to develop the best community that we could have, we should really think about some of this. Now, we may not be able to fully support everyone going to Hajj, but I think we could do a better job in that, going back to those the moral values we have as Muslims versus the dominant narrative, where I mentioned to you that greed is good, this Gordon Gekko idea, or too much is never enough, which is something we hear a lot these days. In our communal conversations as a country, we have choices to make with what we spend our money on. And Allah talks to us in Quran about those who focus on stacking and piling. And what I'm suggesting is that we could do something different with this particular tribulation we're experiencing, and perhaps make an opening to invest ourselves in a different way, which is to take some of that we would normally spend on something else and maybe create a communal fund it could be many communal funds across the country, or it could be one gigantic one. I will leave that more to those people who specialize in financial creation. However, I think that it might be a great opportunity for us as a community to take a tribulation that has created an emotional response to us, whether it's one to seek gratitude or to feel grief, that we create a fund that promotes the welfare of those who have less, namely our women and the less fortunate, those who have less, whether they be children or men. So what we can do is we can take this third opportunity, right, to fill that void that Eid is creating. And we can recalibrate our goals so that the fathers and mothers, one way we can go about this, right, the fathers and mothers can start making goals to send their children to Hajj one day. So just like you plan for your retirement, you can plan to set aside money to help your children go to Hajj one day, even if they get married and decide to stay with their families at home instead of work. This will relieve the husband, but empower women as well. And as always, it will always be the case, not all families will still be able to go to Hajj. They still won't be able to afford it. But we could set up a community fund that empowers women and the less fortunate to go to Hajj. This kind of investment is more solid and yielding than a careless cappuccino or a GoFundMe page that supports something we all find morally reprehensible. We can take this current tribulation and allow it to refine us so that we may grow to appreciate those things that mean so much to us before they are indeed taken away for good. So I appreciate you allowing me to share this short bit of time with you. And again, I apologize for the delay in getting started because of circumstances that were beyond my control. But I hope and pray that we all find a way to enjoy this upcoming Eid and that we allow ourselves an opportunity to experience and sit with whatever emotions that we are experiencing, that we allow ourselves to move through them. And when we get stuck and cannot figure out how to move through them, that we seek help. We have ongoing mental health services through the Islamic Center of Southern California and through the Center for Muslim Mental Health and Islamic Psychology through means of teletherapy. So we can see people throughout the state of California online. It's not exactly the same as seeing a person in person, but it still can be quite affecting. Please avail yourself of those services if you find that you need them. And please take time to connect with, not only Allah, but with your friends and family. One of the things that I think we often forget is that while we have this great tool and resource of mental health professionals, and as we work to reduce the social stigma toward getting and seeking services, we also don't want to throw out the very staple of our friends and family. You may see a therapist once a week, but you will be able to access your friends and family every day if you choose to. So I encourage you wholeheartedly to reach out to your friends and family and reconnect with people you haven't connected with for a while. Check on them, make sure they're okay, and have a blessed Eid, inshallah. Jazakallahu khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.